Welcome to Siemens Pro Series. Today we're going to extend our conversation of requirements decomposition and standards management to risk management. Can't wait to get started. Okay, last time we talked about design decomposition and standards integration. How do we share these standards down into the projects in a way that allows us to get good reuse out of our requirements? Now, one of the things that we really want to talk about now is risk management. How is it that we integrate a risk model into this requirement set, and how do we enhance our set of controls with an understanding of risk? And of course, we talked last time about these product sources. In addition to that, we have test cases that verify and validate the user needs and system requirements. And we want to link the design specifications to outputs. Now, what's really critical about this is what design specifications. So in a design, we might have 100,000 different design specifications. We don't want to track everything related to risk. And the reason for this is there are things that are trivial. So we might have an outer skin where we're not particularly concerned about the location of any point on the skin, but the bosses where we're going to actually be attaching the skin to an internal part, those things we might want to be more concerned about. So there's certain things in a design and many more things in a design that we don't want to track related to things that are really very important and lead to user risk. And those are the things that we want to keep close track of. The thing that defines that for us is the risk management system. And so this is how we get to an understanding of design specifications and which ones of those are worth the time and effort to track them throughout the system. So I'm going to talk about risk management. The risk analysis is really the 14971 compliance piece of the puzzle. This is where we take the harms to users, any user, and hazardous situations that could lead to that harm, and we associate those with one another. So essentially we have a relationship between hazardous situations and harms that is a causal relationship. Hazardous situations cause the harms. Now, the reason we do this analysis is because there's really two outputs that we want out of this. The first is a residual risk. So after mitigation, what risk is there to users once we've already finished with all of our mitigation strategy? The second thing is, what is the mitigation strategy? And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to hierarchically break down our controls in a way that shows how we can create a causal chain to show the mitigation of the hazardous situation, how we control the occurrence of that hazardous situation. Okay, so we have this first report that is harm paired with a hazardous situation, and we process that for an RPL or a risk index number, where and both pre and post mitigation. So we're going to adjust our mitigation strategy, and what that should do is reduce the occurrence of our P1 factor, which is the occurrence of the hazardous situation. So we have control over the occurrence of that hazardous situation and therefore have control over the harm. This is kind of how the methodology works. So this is the P1, P2P. P1, what's the occurrence of the hazardous situation? P2, how often does the hazardous situation lead to the harm? P3 or P, depending on which company you're talking about, but the standard calls it P, is the occurrence, how often does the harm actually occur? So that's really what this report is all about. Now I'm going to give you an example as we move through this so that it's a little more clear how this is applied. So let's just say our harm is infection and our hazardous situation is the device introduces harmful bacteria to the patient. And that harm might be anaphylactic shock, or it might be, some kind of a really bad staph infection. And so we have, let's just say we have a severity of a 5 for the harm, and the hazardous situation, if we don't mitigate this, is going to happen all the time. So we have a high risk situation here with the pairing of these two work items. Now, the mitigation strategy here is going to be a user need, and we're going to use only user needs as the mitigation directly to hazardous situation, and you'll see why in a minute. So the user need is the device, the user needs the device to be sterile. So we're going to mitigate the hazardous situation by assuring we're going to provide a terminally sterilized device as part of this procedure, okay? So the next set is really traceability using the use failure mode analysis. And what we're going to do in the use failure mode analysis is we're going to process each one of these user needs to understand what system controls need to be in place to assure that that user need is met. And so in this case, because the user need is the device will be sterile, the system control is going to be the device will be compliant, in this case with 11135, which is the ethylene oxide sterilization standard. So what we're saying is if we're compliant with that standard, we will, by definition, have a device that's sterile and the user need will be met. Okay, so then we do the next step where we go to the systems failure mode analysis. And that systems failure mode analysis is going to process the system controls to get what design controls are needed. And so in this case, the system control is compliance with the 11135 standard. The design controls we're going to need to have in place are things that are associated with getting that ethylene oxide sterilization done. Now, the standard carries a lot of those, but we might have other things that we want to do too. You know, sterilizing pacemakers is a different process really than sterilizing Band-Aids. And we're going to have special things in our libraries that we want to have included in this set to be sure that we get the right kind of processing done and all the things that we've learned about sterilization into our process. Now, those design controls, I'll just give you a couple examples, would be maybe that the sterile barrier bag will not allow for ingress of harmful bacteria. Okay, so that's the design control that we're going to use. Now, that design control would probably be pulled in from a standard. So what we would do is we'd say, we have a system control that is compliance with the 11135 standard, but in our library, because we're doing this kind of sterilization process all the time for this product type, we would have a 11135 compliance standard document with all the requirements and test cases that we need to be able to do the verification of this particular and validation of this particular problem. And so we would share that document in. The system control and all the design controls would be carried with that library document, and it would populate automatically into our risk management system. We can talk about that when we get to the tool. Okay, so this is really one of the leverage points where we start to take those libraries and automatically populate a lot of our requirements and control set. Okay, so now we're going to go to the design failure mode analysis. The design failure mode analysis then processes the design control, which is this migration of restricting the migration of harmful bacteria into the device through the sterile barrier bag. And now the design specifications might be something like the sterile barrier bag will be constructed from Tyvek, or the sterile barrier bag will have a seal, a 3/8 inch thermal seal. So those design specifications then, because they progress through this traceability up to a hazardous situation harm combination that's of high risk, what that means is this design specification is now critical to quality. And we need to be absolutely sure that we process that properly through our design control system and through our process failure mode analysis to make sure that we have control over that particular design specification. Now, this is why it's important to use risk management to drive your design specifications, because what we're really looking for is what are the design specifications are of particular importance and why are they of particular importance. And that way, as we do post-market surveillance, we start pulling some of this data in from the field. We'll know if we want to make a change to the design, why it is that we had these particular things in place to control this hazardous situation. This is our mitigation strategy. And these four things also represent our design control plan. So these are the things that we're doing in the design to assure that we have control over hazardous situation harm combinations that are of particular interest. Okay, so now we've determined this critical to quality characteristic. We want to drive it through the process failure mode analysis and come up with a set of production controls, which are going to be in the form of inspections of dimensions or of materials, or different process controls like heater bend temperatures or weld temperatures or whatever. So once we finish with that, we process those and include those in the manufacturing process planning stage, and they get built into the bill of process, which is then shared to the manufacturing execution system. And in this way, we have complete control over everything that could happen. This is our causal chain analysis that assures that we've looked at everything in the process to be sure that we're controlling the occurrence of that hazardous situation. Now, one of the reasons to do this process is that each one of these FMEAs have an occurrence associated with them and the risk analysis. So as we collect data from the field and we process that data, we federate and aggregate the data, we do analytics on the data, we can then key it back into the risk management system to understand not only from an FMEA perspective, prospectively what we think the occurrences of these problems are going to be, but also now we can start layering in the data from the field to compare against that perspective view so we know actually what's happening in the field. So this is a very important process where we start to automate all of the analysis of these controls and their effectiveness in mitigating the hazardous situations. So this is really the meat of how to build your risk management system. And the reason why it's so important is it really presents this negative view of the design. What do we need to have in the way of controls to assure that bad things don't happen to users? Okay. All right. So the next step, I'm just going to walk through each one of these analyses and help you understand how this is built out in Polarium. So essentially, you're going to see this looks very similar, I'm sure, to what most people use in spreadsheets, where you have a risk record, and this risk record pairs one harm with one hazardous situation. And of course, we can reuse the harms and reuse the hazardous situations as we see fit. So this hazardous situation, disconnection of the ventilation port, leads to a harm or causes a harm that is cerebral, easy for you to say, hypoxia. And so if we disconnect the ventilation port, what that means is the patient doesn't get their ventilation, which could lead to brain damage, is really what we're saying here. And of course, our mitigation strategy is that the device is resistant to user unintentional contact. And this is going to go directly to one of our standards that we were talking about before. So it's a catastrophic severity. We have a high probability, P1, that the hazardous situation will occur. What is the P1 is the occurrence of the hazardous situation. So we're saying that that's probable. P2 is how often the hazardous situation leads to the harm. So if we get this disconnection, is it likely that it will lead to this kind of brain damage? And we're going to say it's likely. And that leads to how often the harm actually occurs. So it's a relatively remote situation when you start putting all these things together. That leads to a risk index based on the severity and the occurrence of the harm of a B on an A to D scale. And then what we're going to do is say, when we do our mitigation strategy, what do we believe it's going to be? And then we'll reprocess the risk index, just as an example. Okay, so this is a typical risk analysis chart based on the 14971 standard. Now, we have this user need that's been identified now as a mitigation. And what we want to do now is process that user need in a use FMEA. And the use FMEA then takes all of the user needs. And what we start to do then is develop a set of use errors. And those use errors have root causes. And so we're going to get yet another mitigation occurrence level. And we're going to come up with a set of system requirements that will control the occurrence of that particular user need. So as an example, we device is resistant to unintentional contact was our original user need. And what we're going to do to manage that at a systems level is we're going to assure that it complies with this 5356 document. The 5356 document is the one that defines the dimensions of the conical connector. So what we're basically saying is we're going to minimize unintentional contact problems because we're going to use a standard conical connector that's been defined by industry. That's really what we're doing. Then, of course, we go through a set of pre and post mitigation to be sure that this unintentional contact is actually going to be met when we comply with this standard. So then, of course, we go to systems failure mode analysis. And the systems failure mode analysis is going to take that 5356 systems requirement, and we're going to decompose it into different design requirements. And so fitting size is one of the things that we talked about, and that's driven directly from the standard. But there's going to be other things. The exhaust port will survive the drop. Exhaust port will provide sufficient securement for incidental contact. So we're going to test it against incidental contact, just to be sure that not only are we getting our dimensions right, but we're also checking to make sure that the thing that we identified as the risk is actually mitigated by the design requirement that we put in place. Then, of course, we go to design failure mode analysis. And of course, I just go back to this system for a sec. These design requirements were driven directly from the standard. So when I shared the standard from the library down into this project, those were automatically populated. Of course, we get to the design's FMEA. And so this is just one example. It'll survive the drop in a clinical environment, which leads us to this conical fitting dimension specification. So now we're actually saying, what are the dimensions of that conical connector? Are we doing a 30 millimeter or are we doing a 60 millimeter? And we're down to the point where we're going to actually specify dimensionally, what is it that this connector is going to, how is it going to be built? Now, the nice thing about this specification then is we can now replicate that down into our PLM system and use it and attach it directly to the attributes that are built into the models and into the prints. So if I wanted to say, here's a material requirement, then I can associate that material requirement to the attribute in the print or the attribute in the model. And that way we are sure that we actually executed that particular requirement in the design as it was intended. So just a quick thing here, we have this example of impact analysis, and the impact analysis, I'm just going to give you an example here. If we say this 9829, so DC 9829, and we wanted to see what the traceability of that is, 9829, and we display the report, what this is going to give us is another view of the traceability where we're saying the fitting size is this specification. What are the risks for us not meeting that specification from a process failure mode analysis standpoint? And also, where did this all come from, right? Did it come? It came from a system requirement, which came from a system requirement, which came from a user need, which then, of course, leads to a hazardous situation that we're trying to mitigate. So this is just some examples of how we manage all the traceability, and we build into the control set all of the information that's necessary to process. Is this an important thing to users or not? Does this lead to high harm, and how concerned should I be about this particular process? All right, so that's our summary of risk management. Hopefully that was valuable to you. I appreciate you taking the time to look at this today, and look forward to our next